Welcome, everyone. We're so honored to have as our guest today, Cara Tuttle. She has served as the director of the Project Safe Center since its founding in 2014. Cara provides institutional advocacy on aspects of university response systems and processes involving sexual violence, and represents Project Safe on various university task forces and committees, including the Provost Task Force on Sexual Assault and Officer Education Sexual Assault Prevention Committee. Cara previously served as the Associate Director for Student Accountability, Community Standards, and Academic Integrity at Vanderbilt University, and as the Director of Programs for the Women's Center at Northwestern University. Cara holds a JD from Vanderbilt University Law School and a Master of Arts in Women's and Gender Studies from the University of Louisville. Cara was selected as the 2015 recipient of the Mary Jane Worthen Award, which is presented to a member of the Vanderbilt community who has contributed to the advancement of women at Vanderbilt on a systemic level. In 2016, Cara received the K.C. Potter Outstanding Service to Students Award from the Vanderbilt University Office of the Dean of Students. Cara is also faculty in the College of Arts and Sciences with the Women's and Gender Studies program, for which she teaches the seminar on gender and violence. And most importantly, she is my identical twin. Please welcome Cara Tuttle to the Lewis Honors College.
Hello, and thank you so much for having me, and happy Women's History Month. And the topic is a nice lead into next month, which is April, of course, which is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And so I often give talks like this around this time of year, and I'm very happy to do so and be here with you today. I'm going to share a screen. I do have a few slides that go along with the talk. Just one moment here. It's nice to see just some familiar faces. Thanks for saying hi too in the chat. Okay, you're seeing my slides, correct?
Yes, but I also see the next slide's no notes, so I don't think that's the way you want it to show.
I am on a loaner computer after having a work issue, but let's see. Sorry about this.
Looks good though.
Well, thank you. Where am I? Well, I'm very sorry about this. Why I can't make this go away? There we go. Okay.
Yep, there you go.
Okay, but I can't see you now. Okay, there we go. All right, so this is going to be a rapid history because we're covering a lot of time, a lot of territory, but hitting really key moments in the history of anti-rape activism in the United States. And while the issue is getting a lot of coverage in recent years and a lot of awareness on college campuses since about 2011 or 2014, depending on which campus you're on, really the history of activism around this issue goes way back. As Tara mentioned, I have a law degree, so you're getting this from the perspective of legal history, and so we're going to hit some of those milestones as well. So early concepts of rape as a crime are really rooted in property notions, okay? And so the systems that we're dealing with now to navigate these types of harms are still built upon that foundation of property law. Most of early legal history discusses the rape of a woman by a man, so it is very gendered. It's much of the discussion for over 100 years is very much along that binary, although it is much more inclusive, and many state laws have corrected their language in recent years as well to acknowledge the breadth of types of sexual misconduct and who it can happen to and who may perpetrate that. But early on, it was really considered to be the rape or violation of a woman by a man. And the discussion around this was that the violation was a harm of the man's property. And this in legal history is evident whether they're talking about enslaved women daughters, family members, or the wife. And that is not something that we talk about a lot today outside of a legal history class. But when you are thinking about justice systems, and processes and procedures, know that they've evolved from that starting point in the law. And that can make some of the things that are troubling from today's point of view make a little bit more sense, although thankfully we have evolved. And so what is interesting, particularly from a gender studies perspective, is that women were dependent under the law. The prosecutions were more frequent and the penalties more severe than we have seen since women gained some legal independence. And so when women were considered property in whole or in part of either the father or the spouse, sometimes to the brother or the uncle, or to the slave owner, then the sanctions could include castration or even the death penalty for sexual assault. And if you're following this issue on social media today, you might see that convictions are very rare. In our university policies and procedures, findings of responsibility are also similarly rare. And so it's interesting to compare and contrast that with the perspective of over 100, 150, 200 years ago, and to see how we've raised quite a bit of awareness. We've broken a lot of the silences on this topic, but we're not delivering results in terms of accountability. And even when we are, there are very valid complaints about the opportunities for care, education, and rehabilitation. So we find early links in this activism to Mary Wollstone's craft, The Vindication of the Rights of Women. Okay, so that comes out in 1790. And she notes in that the failure of schooling for girls and the powerlessness of women and the challenges they face in abusive, unethical, unsafe, or unhappy marriages. She really scoffed at the limitations that were imposed upon women at the time, and really wanted a fuller role for women, even as wives, even within marriage, within heterosexual marriage, to have more agency, autonomy, and to be recognized for their contributions. And of course, she was advocating for equal status under the law. In the US, we have women participating politically in anti-slavery movements, in temperance movements. Women have always been active as community members. They've been active through religious organizations, through their churches. When there is a crisis or a natural disaster, women have long been active in the recovery efforts of that. So there's a lot of opportunity throughout US history for women to hone these organizing skills. We have the Women's Rights Convention of 1848. That really solidified, it really came about because women had been silenced at earlier meetings and political gatherings, particularly in anti-slavery movements, in the Anti-Slavery Convention. And so we have women you've heard of probably throughout history, and women you very likely haven't, complicated figures, imperfect figures, but we have Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Lucy Stone, and Lucretia Mott, recognized for early suffrage efforts, but if you look into their writings, they're talking about bodies and boundaries and well-being and abuse. And that often gets left out of the conversation, particularly in the elementary and high school education when we're looking at history. If anyone gets to those chapters, which are often in the back of those textbooks, okay? And so we have abolition as really the early fomenting, of this political activity. Over 200 women attend this 1848 convention. The delegates passed the Declaration of Sentiments, similar by design to the Declaration of Independence, and is calling on women to organize and petition for their rights. The right to vote passes in this convention by a narrow margin, and it was quite controversial then. And we've seen efforts to fill these gaps in history really take hold over the past 10 years to talk about the racism within these early suffrage movements. It was pervasive then, and tragically, it's still involved in activist efforts and women's issues across a variety of topics, even today. And so there was a lot of racism that was part of early movements, even with their ties to abolition. And it's often fueled by this concept of scarcity. And so we're always telling some other population who often is more marginalized or disadvantaged, to just wait and your time will come. But you have to look at it from the perspective of like whose rights matter and who's told to wait and who's setting those priorities. And so that was very much a part of the activism at this time. The history of the anti-rape movement in the United States is also the history of the struggle of Black women in the United States against violent racism and sexism. We're just starting to tell this part of the civil rights movement more broadly. So these are concepts and stories that you might encounter if you're in critical race theory, if you're in African American or diaspora studies, if you're in gender and sexuality studies, but this has yet to really be a mainstream part of our education. And so we tend to look at these movements as if these were separate parts, right? So we have abolition, we have temperance, we tend to skip over 1900 to the late 1950s in a lot of dialogues, which really erases a lot of labor organizing and ongoing activism, particularly around the right to assemble, right of free speech, that leads us quite steadily into the civil rights movement. And then the civil rights movement, as you probably discussed in other programs, gets really sanitized throughout historical acts of revisionist history and white supremacy to erase some of the more pointed and direct, indictments of systems, of offices, which is a great example. Is like lots of people know about Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech, and very little attention gets paid in a typical classroom to the breadth of his writings, and just especially some of those later writings. And so what also happens as we're filtering things out and deciding whose story gets told is the erasure of long history of Black women speaking out, breaking the silences about this private harm, right? That was considered a personal violation or not in the political sphere, not in the public sphere, and saying, no, this is happening to me, and this is happening to me at the intersection, right? So we have, before the terminology is coined, writings, discussion speeches saying, I am both Black and a woman, and my body is existing at this point in history, and so much is being projected upon it, and I don't have agency and autonomy around it. And you're saying one set of things and advocating for the rights of women generally, and where is that protection for me and for my family and for women who look like me? And so here I've compiled a timeline of, this is very difficult to put together on one slide because there's so many things, but these are considered major milestones. And I want you to know, how far back it really goes. So we have Sojourner Truth, offering famous remarks, "Ain't I a Woman," which is a wonderful example of this concept of intersectionality, of hypocrisy, of privilege, of racism at work then, still very applicable now. In 1866, the reason the Memphis riots are on the timeline here is in the aftermath, Congress held hearings about this chaos and this brutality that was part of these riots. Black women testified before Congress about being raped by many members of a mob, of a white mob. And so you have really astonishing courage and bravery here of Black women testifying before Congress, speaking out of a topic that then and now still has connotations of shame around it, honor, family honor, where we know that we've been trying the victim, and people still do that when we speculate about celebrity cases. They're testifying in the face of threats and violence and destruction and fire and harm to friends and family, and they are speaking out on the issue anyway, right? And so, let's give credit where credit is due. The issue of rape of race and women and slavery gets taken up by the Supreme Court in 1885. This decision is a travesty. A Black woman who was enslaved was declared to be the property of her owner with no right to defend herself from his sexual and unwanted advances, right? And this is part of history. This is a case that, I did not learn about or read in law school, right? So this is something that gets overlooked, that is considered a mistake of the past by today's standards, but it's very much part of the history that really helps understand how we get to the justice system that we have today. The 1890s, and leading into the early 1900s, we may learn about this generally. You may talk about lynching. People tend to know that lynching is something that occurred, although they often in the United States, like the students I get, even in my course that I teach here, the Seminar on Gender and Violence, who are self-selecting in. It's an upper level gender and sexuality studies course. They know what they're signing up for. It's not a class that satisfies a whole lot of requirements for them. So they're choosing to take it with some familiarity around the topic. And they knew that lynching existed, and they knew some of the stories around lynching, but they were themselves not drawing connections to anti-rape activism. They had heard that, it's argued as vigilante justice, although evidence is often lacking and not necessary, and there wasn't a concern by the mobs who were engaging in this, the mobs that often included law enforcement, by the way, who were really charged with carrying out a system of justice, to go through anything about due process rights. And here we have a very real period in history where we have to confront the racism that leads to today's skepticism about the frequency of false reports. So the public today tends to believe that false reports are much more common than the evidence suggests that they are. And it's very easy for people in the field to say, oh, there's no evidence of that. And there's, and it's my job to know the data. And so we look at FBI data. FBI is not known to be a feminist organization, my friends. We have the FBI data that has shown a very small percentage of what they categorize as false reports to really only be between 2 and 8% of reports. That puts sexual violence, sexual assault on par with other crimes. So you'll hear prevention educators saying, well, no, people are no more likely to lie about experiencing sexual assault than they are carjacking or mugging. And the data suggests that that's true. But it's really important to know that sometimes those posts and those statements in isolation feel really hollow because we're not acknowledging the very racist history around the dialogue of sexual violence. And so it's important to note that lynching absolutely occurred with a greater frequency than many people understand, in horrific violence that would occur to the body before or after the hanging, and signs and messages, that were conveyed or put up around that. What is in the history of anti-rape activism are documented stories of Black women who were lynched and of lower economic status white women who were engaged in consensual sex with Black men. So the efforts to really contain segregation, right, to keep the races separated, resulted in violence, state violence, mob violence, lots of white violence against Black men, Black women, and against whites who were engaged in some consensual sex, who were friends with the wrong people, who were hanging out with the wrong people. And that is so rarely part of the story around this. So you have Ida B. Wells Barnett's journalism really exposing the horrific realities of lynching. And if you read her writings, they're explicitly discussing the fear of interracial sex, of interracial marriage, of interracial children, and the specter of Black male sexuality linked to stereotypes that continue today, right? That can be very, very harmful. And so these stories were put in white newspaper after white newspaper about all sorts of alleged violence, whether it is glances or intimidation or following, and the stories of these suggested hypersexualized Black men who were threatening white women. And the discussions then talk about that links the purity of the white women. And so we have writings and discussions and challenges in the law taking place where Black women are coming forth and saying, I have been sexually assaulted. You say you care about this, you know, where is my justice? And that is then coming forward in times of you know, incredible racist violence. And when we think about why people don't come forward, or why there might be silence around this issue, or why certain identities or communities have developed practices of trying to address it within the community, this very racist history makes perfect sense when we think about why that might be. And even if you're in a situation now where we've raised awareness, we've reduced stigma, there's available resources, they're free, they're in the right neighborhoods, people can get to them, we're still dealing with these lingering effects of past discrimination occurring in these issues. So we have continuing, you know, suffrage efforts at this time by women of all identities. We have some racism occurring within suffrage, so we get separate organizations and societies addressing issues from a variety of viewpoints. Women get legally the right to vote in 1920, which is a constitutional amendment, which on its face applies to all women. But we know that in reality, again, there's these threats of violence, including the threat of sexual violence, confusion, discouragement, lost paperwork, misgraded citizenship tests, lots of efforts, you know, bombings, burning of homes, rise of the Ku Klux Klan. We have lots of violence here, much of which always has a threat of sexual nature to the children and to the women. It's still very gendered in this way throughout time to discourage the use of that right, in the pursuit of that right. And so that's very much an undercurrent of the suffrage movement and leading us into the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement also is credited with giving women another surge of opportunity and exposure to organizing. It's often attributed to leading right into the women's movement. There was definitely sexism within the civil rights movement. We have these complications, we have these issues recurring in activist efforts time and time again. The second wave, if you talk about it as waves, which makes sense as surges, but not as isolated moments, right? We already talked, there's always this steady thread of movement and activism. Now, progress isn't linear, but the way we've been teaching these things in the public school system are as if these are isolated, and that is not helping our students draw these connections from one issue to the next and one activist effort to the next. When we have a women's movement, which is taking place broadly, right? It's not that solidified. We talk about it as if it is, but we have different iterations. You have, you know, in New York is different from DC, is different from California. In white organizations, it's different than organizations led by Black women. We have infighting and discrimination against lesbians and against bisexuals within the National Organization of Women. So you get lots of writing and lots of action around the issue of women in terms of gender identity, but not the strongest connections, right? Due to these internal schisms and discrimination that occurs within them. But we have lots of writing coming out at this time about women talking not just about sexual violence, sexual assault, but also intimate partner violence. This private harm, the personal is political, coming into the public realm. These are women's lives, these are the threats that they face. So this becomes, you know, a pivotal moment where women are able to connect with one another more broadly, realizing this is happening to me too. And Me Too, as you know, will become a rallying point much earlier than 2018, but more on that in a moment. This anti-rape movement, this domestic violence movement of the 70s was a matter of survival. It's always been a matter of survival. And sometimes we dismiss the efforts of women's movements throughout history as complaints, and some of these stereotypes and projections of women being emotional or hysterical that have reappeared over and over throughout history were used in our discussions and analysis of women's movement. But here it's very clear that women were not only being raped and assaulted and harmed and molested, but also murdered. So this is an issue of survival. Before 1970, we don't have records indicating that there were many rape crisis centers. We don't have shelters for battered women, right? We have the beginnings of these things. We have community organizations who are helping people. We have the beginning of hotlines and networks, but it's really coming together. And we have, in terms of legal history, the petitioning for government funds and the passage of laws gaining more ground at this time than ever before. Marital rape was largely permissible. It was considered an entitlement of marriage. You should know that the last state to address this, to revise the law, was as late as 1996. Okay, so this is 20, 30, 40 years, of activism on this issue. This isn't, in my lifetime, people saying, you know what, this was wrong and we should address this. This was a debate. This was intense. This is organizing that was taking place in a variety of ways. Lots of individual advocacy, taking care of the individual survivor. And I'll say, consider your resources on campus. Consider your resources in a community. When the resources are insufficient, when these offices like mine throughout history have had insufficient resources, the people who care about the issue, the people who are responding, they are left to triage their day. And so victim support, victim advocacy is always taking priority, which means when there are insufficient resources in your community, on our campuses, nationwide, that prevention comes second at best, right? So it's not surprising when we compare and contrast what we're talking about today as women's history with the recent surge of activism around campus-based sexual assault. Because the model, until very recently, was to have often one overworked, underpaid, often a woman of color, responsible for all prevention and victim advocacy on campus. They weren't the only ones carrying the weight, because I want to give credit to my feminist foremothers, lots of women's faculty who lobbied for women's centers, who are lobbying for feminist studies, women's studies, gender and sexuality studies, creating committees, faculty women's organizations. The history is long and varied. And so you'll have centers that have been, women's centers have been around for 40 years, or women's centers have been around for 5 years, right? This is an issue where there's still ongoing activism and very much still a need that documented by lots of quantitative data. And certainly when we listen specifically to the voices of experiences, a major contribution to be made in our communities. All of this is laying the groundwork more and more for arguments about decision-making. And there are connections here, although I'm not going to go real deeply into these today, with reproductive rights movements, right? Who is making decisions about whose bodies matters, and who has control and decision-making authority over their own bodies. These arguments are obviously playing themselves out as we speak in multiple states today. And so the case law, in terms of legal history, builds and builds. So women's legal rights gains built upon precedent from the civil rights movement and LGBTQ rights. They established, their own legal precedent and also build upon women's legal precedent and civil rights precedent built upon labor rights. And so we have, in legal history, when precedent is so important, we're drawing those connections throughout history and have the ability to see the evolution, which sometimes, granted, is really painfully slow. We have then lots of organizing and different records throughout history, lots of organizing at churches. So churches are key here. Churches became the site of women's organizations and consciousness raising groups, a place that women could gather. And this was true for women, Black and white during this time. And we get a sense, and we get this gathering around the bumper sticker that sometimes people think is dated, and the motto, "The personal is political," because we still face arguments that some things belong to the family, belong in the home, shouldn't be discussed publicly, should be dealt with informally. The government shouldn't play a role. And what we also see, though, is when these things are left out of the discussion, when they are left out of budgets which I believe are moral documents, strategic plans, and these are lists of priorities, who is writing the law, who is making these decisions, who is represented in those meetings, who decides? Well, then it's very easy to see how we get here in terms of staffing and funding and resources and progress or not on these issues. We have this ebbing and flowing throughout time. A major educational moment for the American public was definitely during the confirmation hearings of Clarence Thomas when he was nominated for the Supreme Court. And I highly recommend the documentary, Anita Speaking Truth to Power, if you're interested in this. I know Kerry Washington made a version of that too, which is great, but I really like hearing from Anita herself. And you get lots of coverage, excuse me, and you see things that just jump, off the screen today that I think a lot of people consumed without a raised eyebrow back then, which is her testifying in a very calm voice with a lovely, pleasant demeanor to a wall of white men who were saying things that, some people definitely thought were atrocious then, but definitely feel biting, out of date, victim blaming, woefully misunderstood when watched, in 2021. Discussion of this came up during Biden's campaign because, he's a complicated figure in this respect. He's long advocated for awareness and fundraising and the Violence Against Women Act, on this issue. He has a remarkable history of advocating for this compared to his peers. Yet, it was very clear, because it becomes divisive. This leads to, if you look at 1992 here, politically what was known as the Year of the Woman. We've since had another Year of the Woman, but for a long time in political science, everyone knew you were talking about 1992. And it was in women's reaction to the discussion, the news headlines, the television coverage, and the behavior of the congressmen during these hearings. I can tell you, as a lawyer sitting here today, Anita Hill was the dream client to have testified. I mean, the composure, the deference, which is unnecessary, but the performance of respectability, which very much was her being, but was often required, right, of women to be believed when they're speaking on these issues, was perfection. I can't imagine having a better person testify on this, yet still it was such a brutal conversation, and one in which lynching gets mentioned, right, by Clarence Thomas himself. So we're bringing this history back up, and it became part of the dialogue. And sexual harassment had been coined as a term a few years before. It's discussed in some legal journals, but the public was not getting an education on this. And so this is where we see the first surge of those terrible sexual harassment prevention videos that some of you may have viewed in early jobs and careers. I know that when at one point I was a server at Lone Star Steakhouse and Saloon, we had to watch some videos. This is when I had a job in college. I'm pretty sure the video was from 1992. And a lot of people still have this idea about prevention programming. You have very clear scenarios, right? You have the handsy, the creepy, the lurking supervisor who comes over the shoulder and is touching and says things explicitly, so that the public did gain an understanding of quid pro quo, this for that. The offer of something, I will give you a promotion if you engage in this sex act with me, okay? And everyone offered these programs, but it becomes a compliance issue. It is something the company, the college, the university, the professional association, they can say they did the thing, we check the box, we warn people, everybody has noticed, we write the policies. My students still go on to work at companies that have not updated their policies since 1992, 1994. I tell them to go ahead and send them to me, and to where they feel able, join committees about revising those, or send them to me, and I'm happy to take my red pen to them and offer them new language. So these things have been sitting on a shelf collecting dust, unfortunately, because when something becomes a compliance issue, that can be important. That can be important recognition. I will take it. I will take it. But let's view compliance before the bare minimum that we have to do, where the government has come in, usually decades late, saying, we have not sufficiently addressed this issue. You are required, for these reasons, you fall into certain categories, to do at least this. And we see, bring it back to campus, recent years, we see the same thing happening here. Immediately, in 2014, when the White House creates a task force to address sexual violence, I get contacted by so many vendors, because it's very clear what my job is when you're Googling, trying to sell me the new compliance product. This is a market that has exploded. There are now tons of things in teal, our awareness color, that I can purchase. There are videos upon videos and online modules now galore to choose from. Very few of them, though, are considered ideal to those of us who work in the field. Sometimes they're quickly made. They're very effective for distribution, getting people to open a policy. You can't confirm if they read it. I try to choose the module. We use modules here. I mean, it should be part of a comprehensive prevention program. It should be part, but let's not rely upon them solely. I also have parents who do them for the student. So keep in mind that you aren't always guaranteeing you're reaching your target audience. Parents will call sometimes and say that they get stuck in the module, and that's how I learned that. But I pick the one that hopefully traps the student in the learning content and is a choose your own adventure guide through the module. And yet we still are having widespread reports of all the whole range of behaviors on college campuses. Again, to give credit where credit is due. Women have long had to tell their stories, their horrific stories, their intensely personal stories of abuse over and over to rally enough audiences, enough people, citizens, voters, board members, decision makers to care. And recent activism is no different. Colleges and universities were aware this happened on campus. There's long been, and thank you, there's long been the person that the Whisper Network says, go talk to so-and-so. It's safe to go talk to them. They care. They will help you. We've seen the early creation of resources. We've seen some promotion of referral to off-campus resources in the community. But for a long time, it was still being handled very quietly. And any organization has motivations to not want bad press around this issue. Bad press leads to inquiries, leads to more press, leads to lawsuits. And so it's putting the company, the organization, the association, the college, university in a tough spot. And it leaves the people who do these jobs in a tough spot for wanting to raise awareness, to confront the full scope and reality of the issue, to tell truths about the communities to which we belong. while they're taking such care to not increase liability. And this is the role of lawyers. Many good lawyers want to take care of whoever their client is, but you have to think about who is the client, and where are the conflicts of interest. And this sort of gets really complicated about who does what on campus and where they report to. My career has been coming up through university women's centers and dealing with this issue, but people like me who care about the issue, I'm very vocal on the issue. We were not getting results consistently and effectively until it was happening simultaneously with student activism. And you have films like The Hunting Ground, you have the men and women, and telling this horrific story in these early films. We now have more films that are telling the story of our trans students, of our genderqueer and gender non-binary students, but we are asking them over and over to share their pain as if we don't know the scope of the problem. And it becomes an intense fight, because when you have a period of suddenly taking this issue very seriously, and you have a surge in reporting because we have reduced stigma and we have increased resources and we have more people coming forward for support. We also have broader designation of employees as mandatory reporters. So we do have an increase in reports for the last 10 years. It's not corresponding into the same amount of cases moving forward through investigations or findings. Okay. So we can take a sample school, for example. The school may get 400 reports in a given year. Really only about 25 of those are likely to move forward with an investigation by a school's Title IX office, for example. And this varies widely. We are collecting data on this as we speak. But we're seeing, at best, a 25% chunk of those cases moving forward through a process. And I'm not suggesting necessarily they should, because I'll tell you, the people who go through the process have really troubled feelings around that. The complaints about these processes and procedures, despite many people's good intentions, it's not that everyone doesn't care. I work with a lot of people and work with a lot of different institutions too. I do some consulting, who do care, right? But we're expecting a lot of swift action and change within higher ed. Many of you serve on committees or work in higher ed. You understand that sometimes that change is slower than we would like for a variety of reasons. The students are often driving conversations about restorative and transformative justice. And the new regulations that came out in May 2020 cover a lot, but they also do include room for informal resolution policies and procedures. The trend, though, is that on college campuses, that is the thing people didn't get to. And to be fair, to be perfectly fair, we get an announcement of these new regulations in May 2020 with an August 14th, 2020 implementation date. Your Title IX teams, your victim advocates, your lawyers, your risk management, these people were scrambling at college after college in that time frame to comply with the law, because compliance becomes, the first priority. We have to comply. The federal government is saying we have to comply by this time. And this is a shift. If you even look at student conduct history, because where we've been moving in student conduct is to have educational processes. It's supposed to be an educational component. We don't want to just rubber stamp probations and kick people out. There's supposed to be some learning and student development theory that is shaping these policies and procedures. And this was a real rapid shift into a very legalistic set of expectations. And that is coming after there had been movement in that direction already. Because when you start to take more cases, there begin to be more lawsuits. Who is suing? Typically, the more privileged person has the opportunity to hire the lawyer or the lawyer for more hours and sue on this issue. When institutions, organizations, companies, associations are getting sued, that's where they're concerned about reducing liability. This has been very concerning to me because typically far fewer of the complainants who are either the targets of the harm, victim or survivor, those are in complainants in the process, are less likely to sue. They are less likely to have the resources to hire the lawyers. What we're talking about is inequity, which is connected to all the other forms of discrimination, which is connected to oppression. Overwhelmingly, sexual violence is something that happens disproportionately to populations that are already facing discrimination or other vulnerabilities. So the dialogue around this has been focused on equity in Title IX and student conduct policies and procedures. And I remain very concerned about the inequity that is leading right up to the filing of the report, and also what happens after the filing of that report. So this is very much, an issue that continues. I want to show you a few quotes and give you some recommended reading. There's so many stories we could pull out from this. Charlotte Pierce Baker is a lovely woman, wonderful woman, who used to teach the class I now teach at Vanderbilt. And when she retired, that's when I stepped in and then now teach the seminar on gender and violence. But she has a book that was considered really pivotal, groundbreaking, much like the Audre Lorde speech that I love, many people love, The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action. We have this the Speak Out. The Speak Out is an event that still happens. It's crucially important because saying this has happened to me and finding out that it has happened to others and saying that it is wrong and feeling entitled to feel like it's wrong and feeling entitled to the anger and the pain and the heartbreak and acknowledgement of the pain that comes from the lack of the response. Her book was one of now many that were beginning with this dialogue, and hers in particular focused on Black women's experiences. And we're seeing across identity more work like this. Now, in terms of legal history and tracking it in terms of the timeline, I really like this book, At the Dark End of the Street, Black Women, Rape and Resistance, by a notable historian. When you read this book, it's extensively cited, and that's great, and very useful, because sometimes we still face challenge around this topic. People are really holding on to myths and misinformation, and sometimes having those citations can be really useful. This is a white woman historian who was outraged and has written this book. So I recommend it, but I recommend it in conjunction with other resources that are putting the Black women's voices center. Fannie Lou Hamer, she's very well known within the civil rights movement, but her writings, if you look at them with lens anew, with new eyes, you can draw out all of this conversation that is so much about Black women and is about sexual violence. Historians sometimes know that's in there, but she becomes a well-known figure, and sometimes that part of her dialogue is erased. I highly recommend the film Loving. It's based on the Supreme Court case Loving versus Virginia. You really see the wrangling there of different justices, different courts and legal voices, and really racist arguments that we made about children and the children of interracial couples and social class. It's one of the easiest to remember given the name, because this is Richard and Mildred Loving shown here. If you've seen the license plate from Virginia that they had for many years, that Virginia is for lovers, that is a reclaiming of this moment, in their history. Lots of the signs, the evidence is really here. We talked a little bit about Anita Hill and respectability. Joanne Little is pivotal from a historical point because she was unapologetic about her sexual nature, about her dress, about her vocabulary, and instead of, which is what many lawyers did and still do, actually trying to dress and style and shape the appearance and voice and testimony of people at trial. I mean, she really just refused to be so tamed. And She was attacked while in custody. And this was a turning point, though. This was a turning point for an interracial jury, interracial banks of lawyers on the case, and paired up with 70s activism. There are a lot of great videos of Joanne Little talking and people singing around this. And this is the case that is considered changing the world. We talked about Anita Hill, not to blow past major contributions and lifelong contributions as a legal scholar and activist. If she hasn't come to your campus recently, I highly recommend having her come back. It was a highly popular and attended event. And it's something that you may have lived through if you're faculty and staff, but I promise you your students are very interested in that history as well. And they likely know who she is, even though that is now something that occurred before many of them were born. Student activism, particularly at HBCUs, has long been a part of progress on this issue. At FAMU in particular, and at Harvard, much more recently, at Columbia, we see women of color who are remarkably brave activists in isolation, but also through their Black student unions and organizations, the African Student Union, they are really modeling for everyone else who doesn't quite understand intersectionality or getting it right, the activism on this issue and how it can be both. I mean, the shootings, from last week, I'm encouraged by the dialogue around hate crimes, because hate crimes, and I'll wrap up with this, are something that people know the terminology. We got some laws passed declaring something a hate crime, but you should go look at crime reports, because very rarely does something end up classified as a hate crime, even though we could check that box on a form. Very rarely. So where there's data for that, I urge you to take a look, because who is making the decisions and who speaks out, who is reviewing the forms, all of this matters, right? Whose voices matter and how they're making decisions about whose bodies matter. And that's long been at root of the conversation, and it continues on. There's a lot of pain and a lot of feeling. I'm hoping that what comes from the public outcry, of the past week on this issue is that we are considering it more broadly. A lot of people are trying to talk about it without acknowledging race and ethnicity and connections to sex work. So I'm seeing a lot of feminist activists make the connections with massage parlors and the racism and ethnocentrism and xenophobia and fetishization that gets projected there that can increase vulnerability. So I would just urge you, as you have these dialogues, not to try to sanitize it too much, because one, your students want to talk about it, and they're making these connections on social media, even if we're afraid to make them in the classroom. But this is an issue that we're just still in the midst of working to resolve, and we see, of course, the bravery, the courage, the progress, the risk, the harms being endured by those, in borderlands and those at the margins, and that remains very true, probably on your campus or whatever community you're rooted in today. So here is your rapid fire, 150-year history of anti-rape activism. I am sure that there were important things that I left out. I am happy to keep the conversation going, so please feel free to reach out to me on either social media, LinkedIn, or via email, because I know there are things that some of you surely were hoping I would discuss that I didn't get to today. But I hope that you enjoyed this. I'm going to check the chat now and see if I can take a few questions. Thank you for the comments we already have already. If anyone is more comfortable sending it privately, you can send it to me or Tara, and we won't share your name if there's something in particular you want me to speak to. I just, to take one more moment on the shootings of the Asian and Asian American women that occurred last week, in Atlanta, you see the news outlets. If you can watch the headlines come out, right? You can watch the tweets come out, the headlines come out. And I see learning happening. I see revision, sometimes quick revisions. I see fear sometimes of getting the headline wrong or not telling the full picture. And in the arc of history, I'm encouraged by that learning. But what I think we have got to stop doing, which is done a long disservice, is treating these things in isolation. And the law is failing miserably, right? The law often chooses a person to decide, is your complaint about racism or sexism, right? And you have to choose which one. And sometimes they go to different offices. And which one's worse, or where do you more strongly identify? And when you look at the survivor narratives, they are acknowledged this complication. And we just don't need to perpetuate that, right? So we don't need to perpetuate that. So yes, like last week's issue is an issue of gun violence, is an issue of xenophobia and anti-Asian American hate that has been on the rise, that is linked to our discussions of COVID, and it is part of gender-based violence, and it is part of the sexualization and fetishization, and it is a discussion of sex work. All of these things are what's going on. And I really want to tell you that the students are getting that, right? And it's generational or micro-generational. People are used to, because that's also long how we've been taught, treating these as separate pieces when really the connections tell the whole story. And so we shouldn't be erasing those in our conversation.
Well, we are right up on our hour. Please tell folks where they can contact you, or give them your email if they want to follow up with questions or comments.
Yes, so I try to keep it all in alignment so that I'm easy to find if you want to find me. So it's Cara Tuttle Bell. That is a 2-word non-hyphenated last name. And so on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook, I think everywhere I am is Cara Tuttle Bell, right? Just make it all one word. For my work email, it is cara.tuttle.bell@vanderbilt.edu. And so I do think I set up an alias so that if you forget one of the dots, it'll still get to me. Thank you, Tara, for putting that in the chat. Most of the time, I am a staff director of violence prevention and victim advocacy. And I teach the seminar on gender violence in the spring. I do lots of public speaking and talks, and I'm happy to help anyone. I mean, Cara and I come from a long line of teachers. We just value education. We love education. We chose our careers. I want to work with students. So if you want to do any research or writing and you want some recommendations, got some further questions, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks again. Let's give our guest a round of applause.
Thank you for having me. It's nice to see everyone.